You wait, paralyzed with fear, gripped with anxiety and exhilaration as you debate your very existence before entering through the curtain of nightmarish fog, holding your breath as you meet the sheer terror awaiting your presence. Your heartbeat quickens, your hands begin to sweat, unless you're one of the lucky ordained few. You've spent hours, possibly days or even weeks, slaving away through the deadly drab streets of Yharnam, praying and dreaming of this elusive moment. You've navigated the terrors around every corner, dodged, slashed, rolled, parried, and riposted. Finally, you meet your destiny. Will you conquer the nightmare? Upon first playing, Bloodborne was so foreign to me, and I was such a noob that I didn't even know how to equip weapons or enter a level. I distinctly remember running around the Hunter's Dream for a solid 15 minutes trying to figure out what to do, and may have even Googled how to get back to Central Yharnam. It sounds ludicrous, but Bloodborne was my introduction to From Software, and really any game even close to this genre. Before that, the only thing I really played was the yearly entry of FIFA. Roma is my favorite team, if anyone cares to know. To fill in the gap a little bit, from about 2011 to 2018, I played FIFA almost exclusively, until my brother got me Red Dead Redemption 2 for Christmas. Probably just knowing that it was an acclaimed game, and that the Wild West and the Last of the Outlaws is right down my alley. This is what originally broke me out of my singularity with FIFA. But it was shortly after that I began digging through the $20 bin at Best Buy filled with all the classic PS4 titles. Being only $20, I snagged up Bloodborne mostly because I knew it was highly rated and the cover art was intriguing. I honestly had no idea what type of game it was. I knew it was probably an action game of sorts, but that's about it. No clue who From Software was, definitely no clue who Hidetaka Miyazaki was, and I'm not positive I had even ever heard of Dark Souls at the time. I didn't know what I was getting myself into, but I knew something felt different than anything I had ever played before. Central Yharnam, the Cleric Beast, and Father Gascoigne. To start from the beginning, even the character creator that the game opens with didn't make much sense to me. As I can see, okay, there's classes and stats, but what do obscure things like Blood Tinge and Arcane actually mean in terms of what my character will be able to do in combat? Again, as someone completely new to From Software, I had no idea what a build was in the context of Bloodborne. I'd imagine if you had come from Demon Souls or Dark Souls 1 and 2 at the time, you'd be able to at least grasp that you'd want vitality, endurance, and some combination of strength and skill. Interestingly, Bloodborne is the only game in the Soulsborne series where your starting class isn't tied to your initial weapon layout, as you choose that later. Of course, we begin unequipped, and in this scenario, I run around the werewolf a few times and get the stagger and backstab. I'd like to say this is what happened on my first run, but it obviously was not. The werewolf in the clinic acts essentially as the grafted scion in Elden Ring, transporting the player, in this case, to the Hunter's Dream, the hub area, rather than a tutorial area, of which Bloodborne interestingly does not have, unless you just consider Central Yharnam the tutorial. Bloodborne arguably has the most brutal first level of any in their catalog. Central Yharnam is, however, arguably the most lauded introductory area in the series and holds a special place in my heart. Not only was it my entry to Bloodborne, but my lead into the magical world of From Software. It's quite amusing watching this footage, as my first journey through Central Yharnam on positive set me back a solid 5 to 6 hours. These days, it's a speed run to see how fast I can kill every enemy and get to the Cleric Beast. This Executioner acts as the first real skill test once you have weapons, and it was smart to place him just after this gate shortcut to shorten the player's trip should they perish, which is likely on your first run, and I'd be lying if I said I didn't die to him now and then on a new character. Much of my initial struggle in getting through Central Yharnam lied in the fact I wasn't used to contending with a stamina meter, nor had the experience in cerebrally working through one enemy at a time. Most games I had played allowed for endless mashing of random buttons regardless of what the enemies were doing. I think much of the enjoyment I get from Souls games is due to the accountability placed on the player. This gives extra satisfaction when I play well because I know I achieved victory by making the correct decisions. While other types of combat can be fun, such as in Pirate Yakuza, which I just finished, nothing feels as satisfactory as achieving victory given the responsibility placed on the player in a Souls game. Central Yharnam forced me to be aware of the stamina meter and pick off 1, maybe 2 enemies at a time. Obviously, after countless playthroughs, you can get away with a much more aggressive playstyle, but it's unlikely that carried you very far in your first adventure. The majority of the enemies in Central Yharnam are essentially what we'd call hollows in the Dark Souls series, but their sheer quantity and many narrow spaces are what can trap you. I still remember the first time I wandered the streets of Central Yharnam being completely terrified and immersed by the world. Even 10 years later, and with Bloodborne's much maligned 30 frames per second, something that's never bothered me by the way, the game exudes an atmosphere that I'm completely sucked into. Granted, I'm ironically not much of a horror guy and quite desensitized from years of playing, but I was even terrified of the sewer rats at one point. But From Software, even today with Elden Ring, remains a shining example that art style and direction can often trump photorealistic graphics. Don't get me wrong, photorealistic graphics are cool, but if I wanted that, I'd just walk out my back door and look at the woods for a while. There definitely exist games with realistic graphics that take you away on an adventure. The Last of Us Remake on the PS5 or Red Dead Redemption 2 come to mind, but they're not necessary to build a world that captures your imagination. And getting back to Central Yharnam, this little drop-down revealed by breaking these boxes is really your first decision of, do I really need to see what's down there? The entirety of the first area, being Central Yharnam and the sewers, is fairly contained, with Father Gascoigne walling off further progress. Eventually, you wind up in the sewers regardless of which direction you go. This actually doesn't bother me, as maybe it's me being a 90s kid and growing up with more linear games, but I've never seen linearity as having a negative connotation. Some of my favorite games of all time, the Uncharted series come to mind, are almost completely linear. While in Dark Souls, the player is more free to explore, you're likely going to be funneled into Undead Burg via skill level. It's an unpopular statement, and who knows, maybe I'll change my mind when I lay out my thoughts in a Dark Souls retrospective, but for a first-time player, I don't find Dark Souls to be nearly as non-linear and as interestingly connective as most other players. With a few exceptions, I find that the game funnels the average player into specific directions the majority of the time. Again, keep in mind I'm referring specifically to first runs, not S-tier players that already know every nook and cranny in their sleep. But I digress, back to the video at hand. I half wonder if the intention of the werewolves is supposed to be a skill marker telling the player to go elsewhere and explore the sewers before facing Cleric Beast, but that route wouldn't make a lot of sense, sending you into an area that really doesn't connect back around in an intuitive way on a first run. Extremely difficult to lure one of the two over, as the second almost always follows, creating a scenario in which you're unlikely to survive. Or perhaps they're meant to send you on the run, funneling you down the stairs and into the house, where you can cheese them through the door and thereafter locate the starting point of Central Yharnam. The cheesing part is likely not the intention. On another note, something that Bloodborne does well is place items throughout a level that are actually useful to that specific area or boss. For example, in Central Yharnam, you could find pungent blood cocktails, oil urns, and Molotov cocktails, all of which are greatly useful against Cleric Beast. In a similar way, fire paper is found in Old Yharnam, which also fits the lore. Although much of the time boss arenas are fairly telegraphed, unintentionally stumbling into boss fights keeps the player alert and makes for adrenaline-boosting unexpected encounters. The player shouldn't be totally ambushed, but fog-walling every single boss makes everything too predictable. Unless I'm having a brain fart, barring Elden Ring open field bosses and Sekiro, Bloodborne is the only From Software game where the boss arenas don't initially have a fog wall. Even the way Cleric Beast jumps down to initiate his fight in a seamless sequence instead of through a cutscene or fog wall makes the game feel more organic. From Software does have some S-tier boss cutscenes, Father Gascoigne's opening for example, so each entrance has its place. I still do like the boss being in motion or doing at least something when you find him, rather than him literally just standing there waiting for you to show up because it's a boss fight. You're not going to piece this together on your first run, but you can hear the Cleric Beast cry upon ascending this first ladder. By the time you get to him, you'll likely have forgotten about this noise, but I absolutely love environmental sound design like this. It's such a little thing to add, but when enough cues like this are in a game, it really pulls together an atmosphere. Similar to the Cleric Beast scream you can hear at the top of the first ladder, the theme of Mergo's wet nurse playing near the young girl's house where you get the music box is another one of those nice little atmospheric touches, although something you're unlikely to pick up on an initial playthrough. Unless you have an intuitive mind for storytelling and piecing together worlds, I'd imagine the majority of players are only going to gather a sliver of what's taking place. This, of course, is intended, which is why Gehrman literally says, "Don't think too hard about all of this, just go out and kill a few beasts." All we know is that we've awoken from an infusion in some strange infected land known as Yharnam that we've come to as an outsider, and that we're going to seek something called Pale Blood to transcend the hunt. Given that there is no map or directional cues in Bloodborne, it's extremely easy to get lost. One of the few ways to figure out where to go is NPC dialogue, of which, on a first run, you're likely to have no idea what they're talking about, and by the time you get to where they were talking about, you probably forgot they even existed. However, I still find it far more engaging to perpetually be mapping out in my head where I came from, where I'm going, which streets I have and haven't already traversed, rather than simply following some form of a waypoint marker around. These have their place, but the absence of yellow lines in Bloodborne is a massive gain for immersion. It It will mean missing passageways and shortcuts, which probably enhances your willingness to explore. For example, it didn't occur to me on a first run that you could pass through the house and open the starting gate, meaning my original attempts at the Cleric Beast entailed running through the entirety of Central Yharnam every time. I wonder what percentage of new players find the shortcut gate that leads full circle to the initial Central Yharnam lamp. It doesn't reach the heights of the elevator ride back to Firelink Shrine, of course, but it's a pretty fulfilling moment. You can technically level up before ever seeing the Cleric Beast via consumption of a madman's knowledge located in the sewers, as the player must have one insight to use the doll. This is extremely unlikely on a first playthrough given the location of the item and the lack of information you have on a blind run. The Cleric Beast Arena is quite unique as a grand battle, and the high bridge is awesome in theory, but in practice I found myself struggling with the narrow corridor and camera management required by the Great Bridge. Cleric Beast seems trivial to veterans of the series, but he's a pretty daunting boss if you've never played a Souls game. Large bosses of this magnitude are quite intimidating if you're new to games of this genre. I actually ended up embarrassingly dying here as I got too cocky and decided to go into the fight without leveling up my character's stats, nor my hunter's axe. As crazy as it might be to say, I'm still even today not that great at the Cleric Beast. Taking a broader view for a moment, there are 22 total main bosses in Bloodborne. Believe it or not, the game can be beaten by defeating only 8 of these. 5 are in the DLC, bringing us down to 17. 6 are in entirely optional areas, bringing us down to 11. 2 are unnecessary for progression, and another 2 are skippable via ending choice, leaving us Father Gascoigne, Vicar Amelia, Shadow of Yharnam, Rom the Vacuous Spider, the One Reborn, Micolash, Host of the Nightmare, and Mergo's Wet Nurse. Well, that's 7, you say. You are correct, as one of Cleric Beast or Blood-Starved Beast must also be defeated to get to Cathedral Ward via the Sword Hunter badge giving access to purchase the Hunter Chief emblem, or the door in Uden Chapel opening giving access to Cathedral Ward via the abandoned old workshop route. These 22 bosses break down into roughly 3 categories: monstrosities, gimmick or puzzle, and humanoid, with Cleric Beast obviously being a monstrosity. I had no idea until doing some research for this video that you can actually summon Alfred to fight the Cleric Beast should you progress past Gascoigne and agree to cooperate with the aforementioned before returning to the Great Bridge. Prior to this, you can summon Father Gascoigne for the Cleric Beast encounter. I'm not a big NPC summon guy, but I'd recommend summoning Gascoigne sometime simply for the entertainment of it. It's pretty fun watching him ruthlessly charge down random mob enemies. I should clarify, I'm not a big NPC summon guy now, as I've gotten much better due to thousands of hours in Souls games since I first played Bloodborne in 2019, but on my first run, you better believe I summoned every NPC possible. At the time, I didn't realize this buffs the boss, but I still think I would have taken the trade-off of having a partner in crime, as the concept or skill of understanding boss patterns and attacking appropriately in retaliation was extremely lacking on my end. If you hadn't made your way to the sewers prior to taking on Cleric Beast, you're now likely to do so, in fact must, in order to make your way to Father Gascoigne, the first boss who truly gates off progression as he blocks the way to Cathedral Ward. Down in the sewers, you'll find plenty of enemies who excel in the art of giving the player gigantic windows to practice parrying. I actually completed my entire first run without parrying a single enemy. As ridiculous as it sounds, I really didn't even grasp the concept. I'd be curious how many games in 2015 even had a parry. Nowadays, every third-person action combat game has a parry, but I'm not sure it was as common back then. I'm sure some did, but it appeared less frequently. Parrying is a bit more user-friendly in Bloodborne, as you can do it at range and take advantage of the rally mechanic on slight mistimings that still yield a stagger. The visceral riposte to the parry is superbly satisfying, and much of that comes down to the audio design. It's infrequently discussed, but when we think of audio, we tend to just think of the soundtracks, but the right effects add tremendous gravity and weight to gameplay when implemented properly. While almost all enemies prior to the sewers are technically parryable other than the brick trolls, the large huntsmen have the most telegraph's largest window. The only caveat is they do massive damage, especially the variety with the spear-type weapon. I would have thought the developers would give minimal damage to enemies seemingly meant to learn how to parry, as with the church servants in the Cathedral Ward, but maybe the intent was to teach the risk-reward for accurately parrying and that it isn't something you should rely on in every situation. Either way, go to the church servants if you want to learn how to parry in Bloodborne, as you can fire at them pretty much as soon as their animation starts, and they'll hit one knee, opening themselves to a critical follow-up. The sewers are also where I and most people meet their first NPC in Eileen the Crow, whose quest I of course did not complete on my first run, but more on NPC quest design later. Eventually, I found my way to Father Gascoigne, one of the most iconic and best early bosses in the series. As much as I argue in favor of the inclusion of gimmick and puzzle bosses, and everyone loves a good beast, at the end of the day, mano-a-mano humanoid duels are what really get my blood pumping. Only 5 such main bosses of this type exist in Bloodborne in Father Gascoigne, Martyr Logarius, Gehrman, Lady Maria, and Orphan of Cause, who doesn't 100% fit the bill, but we'll toss him in here. Additionally, we have the Bloody Crow of Cainhurst, who is essentially a boss without a fog gate, boss health bar, and name UI or OST. From Software truly excels at this type of fight, with the 5 named bosses being excellent encounters. I don't necessarily view Father Gascoigne as a tutorial boss, as you've likely had 5 or so hours of game time and fought in Cleric Beast by the time you reach him. This is From Software at their best though. Memorable intro cutscene, fun combat, and well-timed phase transitions. I'm assuming the staircase, rooftop, multiple trees, and gravestones are all meant to aid the player in windows of reprieve, but I recall mostly panicking and trying to avoid, although panicking is probably common in general for your second ever Soulsborne boss, especially during Father Gascoigne's terrifying Phase 3 transition from man to beast and aggressive attacking that corresponds. As well, the terrifying but stunningly brilliant OST is sure to induce a sense of dread and confusion. I'm admittedly not a lore buff. While I'm generally aware of the ongoings of Soulsborne worlds, I certainly don't dissect them in granular detail, but from what I understand, Gascoigne had mistakenly taken the life of his wife, who now lay dead on the rooftop, who forgot the music box to trigger his memory. A music box which you can obtain from his daughter and use to stun Gascoigne for a moment to attack similar to Margit's Shackle in Elden Ring. Even if the story so far had felt vague, it's at this point you know for certain this probably isn't going to be a very positive or uplifting game. It's nice when games build upon prior common mobs that appear throughout the level. For example, as I talked about earlier, there are a variety of hard-hitting, parryable enemies, which is built upon with Father Gascoigne, who is a hard-hitting enemy, with similar, if not more varied and difficult patterns that, while slightly more difficult to time, which makes sense being the boss, are still very parryable. The mix of this parrying, using obstacles to avoid an attack with the large and varied arena, use of the music box, and even Molotov cocktails, especially in Phase 3, concoct for a fantastic boss to close the curtain on the opening stanza of Bloodborne and exit Central Yharnam. Old Yharnam and the Blood-Starved Beast. While other options exist with a few odds and ends open for exploration, especially if purchasing the Hunter Chief emblem and opening the gate to the Grand Cathedral, I first and still usually make my way down to the burned and abandoned Old Yharnam. One of my favorite locations in Bloodborne, as with many areas in the game, is entirely optional in order to complete the main game. But I wasn't to know that on my first journey. I actually didn't originally realize the Chalice dungeons, which can be accessed from items dropped by the Blood-Starved Beast, were entirely optional to the main game as well. Of course, the standout hazard in Old Yharnam is the gunner Jorah on top of the glistening clock tower, and it's one of my great disappointments that you can't actually use this machine gun to fire down enemies upon defeating him. It's always a ton of fun to do this, as seen in a number of other games. I still recall this section being an absolute nightmare on my first journey, with the Gatling gun fire being completely discombobulating when combined with my still atrocious combat skills, as well as generally spazzing out anytime an enemy approached. My personality and playstyle also entails being unsatisfied unless I kill every single enemy I come across, and given Jorah is quite the powerful foe at that stage, it took quite a bit of doing. I can't be certain, but given my skill level at the time, he in all likelihood simply fell off the roof and I went on my way. Of course, you can also make friends with Jorah by coming in the back entrance after defeating Darkbeast Paarl, but I didn't know that at the time, obviously. You pretty much have to take out Jorah in order to fight the NPC hunter below, who has some of the silliest looking AI in the game, continuously running forward towards you, but then backwards across the bridge and into his area if you don't approach him completely. One of the nicest touches design-wise of Old Yharnam is that the enemies will be scared and back off should you wield a torch, which ties in nicely to the lore of the city having been previously burned to the ground in hopes of stopping the spread of the scourge. Never mind bringing the flame sprayer down here, which you can grab from Gilbert, the NPC in the window near main Central Yharnam lamp, who coincidentally transforms into the skeleton-looking enemy type himself as the night draws on. Bloodborne's Victorian rendition of a flamethrower absolutely decimates old Yharnam and is extremely handy on an arcane-only run for those who wish to enjoy. As I mentioned earlier, the items of the pungent blood cocktails, fire paper, and antidote, among others, are a nice touch as they actually have meaning to the area and will aid you greatly with the final boss. Once you finally traverse past Jorah and the Hunter, one way or another, you reach a massive beast blood ritual and, in similar fashion to Central Yharnam, must deal with an extraordinarily large number of enemies for this area, which is actually quite difficult to deal with on an initial run, as it's only after all of this that you finally reach the first shortcut, which doesn't even bypass Jorah's gunfire if he's still alive. Continuing to the finale of the area, it's funny how insurmountable blood-starved Beast and even the werewolves before him felt on the first fearsome adventure, and now it's no sweat whatsoever. Adding to the fear of the fight, though, was the journey back upon death, with the still prevalent lengthy boss treks, unrelatable today as most checkpoints now rest a stone's throw from the boss arena. The blood-starved beast, while not having the sheer size of Cleric Beast, represents a step up in aggression as this ravenous creature thrashes about, although quite predictable as he doesn't do much to prevent access to the booty. And if you didn't know, blood-starved beast can actually be parried. I believe the only monstrosity-type boss where this is possible. As I mentioned earlier, the items found throughout the area of fire paper, pungent blood, and Molotov cocktails can be used in Symphony to absolutely decimate the poor bastard. The boss room itself even contains some antidotes hidden behind the altar. I like to think of these as remnants of fallen hunters before you who attempted to defeat the blood-starved beast, and in this way creates a subtle bit of storytelling without saying a word. The blood-starved beast is aesthetically horrid to look at in every way. I mean, look at the guy, just brutal. A friend of mine refers to him as skin flaps, and for good reason, although the look does fit in perfectly with old Yharnam. As well, I like the idea of the boss being a souped-up version of the enemies throughout the level. And if all else fails in dodging for the booty or spamming him with items, you can always play Ring Around the Rosie with the columns. It's not the most exciting fight anymore as a seasoned player, but that first time was absolutely terrifying. Cathedral Ward and Vicar Amelia. Upon defeating the blood-starved beast, leveling up in the Hunter's Dream, and getting a lore dump from Gehrman and the doll, I most likely, with many others, made my way back to the main Cathedral Ward lamp in Uden Chapel, of which, in a remake, please add the ability to fast travel from lanterns instead of going back to the Hunter's Dream every time. Barring technical limitations, there is really no reason gameplay-wise for this, as you're still doing the same thing in effect, just with an extra step. Anyhow, just prior to entering Cathedral Ward, we would have picked up the Blood Gem Workshop tool. As much as I love Bloodborne, I'll be honest, I straight up hate the gem system. You might say hate is a strong word, but no, I hate and actually despise it. Okay, I'm exaggerating, I don't lose sleep over it, but I'm not a fan of what acts as the infusion system in this game. I see what From Software was trying in theory, but it doesn't come off in practice for me. Maybe I'll sound like a typical modern day gamer saying this, but I find the blood gem system unintuitive, overly convoluted, and complicated. From Software probably agrees as well, as Dark Souls 3 streamlined the system in simplifying upgrading your weapon with the correct material, then using one of a handful of infusion gems to allow for skill, strength, etc., rather than in Bloodborne, a plethora of all kinds of gems with various functions. I know many people love going into the Chalice dungeons, diving to obtain the best gems, and love the system, so maybe it's just me. It doesn't by any means ruin the game for me, it just isn't my favorite implementation of an infusion system. I want these essays to skew to the positive and act as love letters of sorts to my favorite games, but another critique I have of most From Software games is even if you listen to every word of NPC direction, by the time you get to where they're talking about, you've likely forgotten what they even said. Of course, it's easy to connect the dots now, knowing the game inside and out, but on my first run, by the time I got to Cathedral Ward, I likely forgot, for example, Gilbert even existed, let alone who or what he told me to go look for. In this scenario, it doesn't matter too much, as you're essentially funneled to Cathedral Ward regardless, but this happens quite a bit in Soulsborne games. As well, little knowledge drops like this work to develop the overall picture of the world we're in on the positive side. I like to play these games as blind as possible, but doing this causes me to miss almost every single quest. I might meet each NPC once, possibly twice, but the likelihood I met an NPC, find them at every location, and fulfill their dying wish to complete their quest almost never happens. For example, after completing Bloodborne for the first time, I began to look into video critiques and reviews to see what I missed, eventually coming across someone discussing the NPCs in Uden Chapel. Meanwhile, I'm sitting there thinking, I've literally never seen any of these people in my life. I almost think From Software NPC quests aren't meant to be completed without the internet. We praise these games for not hand-holding, but are people really finding these quests from start to finish without running to the internet? I'll get to more examples when I analyze the other From Software games, and Elden Ring did try to rectify this problem a bit, but I wouldn't even say Bloodborne has the most egregious examples. Point being, is it good quest design when the likelihood the average player completes said quest without consulting YouTube or Fextralife is so low? Maybe I'm just a naive, oblivious player and everyone else is like, duh, dude, just go to where they tell you. But I think a lot of that is people acting like it's easy once we've played these games countless times and know every square inch of the universes. Did you really figure everything out blind in your first run? On the positive side of NPC quests, completing Eileen's, which I will say is one of the better ones, my favorite in Bloodborne actually, and takes place in the Cathedral Ward, leads to arguably the most difficult non-boss in the Bloody Crow of Cainhurst. It's not 100% confirmed, but if this guy is a Vileblood, how OP must the Executioners have been to have wiped a tribe of these dudes out? This bastard is an absolute beast, where sweet drip as the kids say, and if he parries you, your life is basically over. Certainly one of the hardest NPCs in the Soulsborne series, and I still have to take a deep breath before fighting this guy even today with how risky attacking is due to his parry and how much health he has along with a blood vial. Patience really is the name of the game to bypass his sweet Chikage, arguably my favorite weapon, and repeating pistol. In returning to our current place in Cathedral Ward, I will take the L for this one, as not even the poor chapel dweller who I instantly destroyed without second notice hopped up on the adrenaline of taking out Father Gascoigne and still being quite jumpy while playing Bloodborne. Anyways, you're likely to continue out the newly opened door to the right and make your way through the abandoned old workshop, which simply adds some lore and acts as a new connective passageway inside the main gates of Cathedral Ward, where you come face to face with the absolutely gigantic church giants. Of course, these days, staying close to them and dodging past their massive but slow and telegraphed attacks is done with relative ease. They were literally nightmare material on my first adventure. And they do constitute a nice new enemy type at this point in the game. The church servants essentially replace the hollow-like huntsmen from central Yharnam and act as parry practice. As well, snatchers lurk in the shadows to lock you away in Hypogean jail, but more on that later. At this point, I usually head over through the Hunter's Woods to Hemwick Charnel Lane for a few more levels and the Rune Workshop tool, but in continuing exploration of Cathedral Ward, we of course come across one of the biggest pain in the ass NPC fights From Software has ever created, which is basically the result of the huntsman with the rifle having an infinite supply of quicksilver bullets, which he isn't shy about spamming you to death with. Vicar Amelia is another boss who seems easy now, but terrified the life out of me at the time, and that was even with bringing old Hunter Henri into the fight. It seems silly now with how desensitized I am, but as someone who never really sought things out that were even mildly considered horror, bosses like this were so genuinely scary to me. Much of this can probably be attributed to the cutscene that introduces the fight wherein Amelia completes her transformation into Beast. Combat-wise, she actually still can be a bit tricky without a serrated weapon or buffs, as well if you lack a numbing mist to deactivate her healing ability. The key, of course, is to stay close and break down her limbs as she staggers fairly easily, especially if you can hit her hands and legs simultaneously. Amelia, of course, shares a soundtrack with the Cleric Beast, as they are both members of the Healing Church, as also referenced on her gold pendant. Following the fight, we of course see an iconic cutscene showing a dispute between Laurence and Willem, but the only problem is by the time we meet Willem at Byrgenwerth, do we really remember this is the same guy from the cutscene? Maybe I'm just not good at piecing together stories, but I honestly watch this and think, oh, cool cutscene, but who the fuck are these two guys? I think, okay, there's a division. Laurence wants to use the healing blood. Willem wants to use insight to evolve. Maybe the whole intention is for the community to help each other piece the story together afterwards, but I am personally never going to recall a 1-minute cutscene 4 hours later when I get to Byrgenwerth. I have nothing against this scavenger hunt type of storytelling for those who love this style. All I can say is I never feel like I take to it as quickly as most, and that's okay. Hemwick Charnel Lane and the Witch of Hemwick. Before we traverse to Byrgenwerth by way of the Forbidden Woods, I usually dart over to Hemwick Charnel Lane, as this area generally only takes about 20 minutes to zip through, even if you explore every nook and cranny, in part thanks to arguably the easiest boss in the game. Although, on my first run, I thought the Mad One that initially spawns was the boss and got instantly decimated, which is pretty hilarious in retrospect. One of the most important aspects to a game, and not often discussed, is the pacing. If you have long stretches that are too easy, the game gets boring and stale. If you have long stretches that are too difficult, the game becomes frustrating and you think about dropping it altogether. Hemwick Charnel Lane feels like a nice area to show off your newly obtained skills and leveled up character, as opposed to the beginnings of Central Yharnam. The enemies are essentially a female witch version of the huntsmen that basically function as the hollows or dreglings of Bloodborne. That being said, on a first run, especially for a new player, there are a couple of difficult sections, namely the area where a dog runs out and there's a witch above throwing Molotov cocktails. As well, later in the level, the large pack of dogs that ambush you can be quite tricky to contend with, and even one more than I thought always seems to leap out at me. Add on top a few executioners who are no joke early on, and Hemwick Charnel Lane does have its choke points. Not to mention the bevy of enemies that block way to the witch's abode, but hopefully by now you've gained the ability to pick off enemies one at a time. That being said, should you die to the Witch of Hemwick, the trek back is quite the run, even with shortcuts open by today's standards. On another note, I think one of the reasons From Software's games are so satisfying is because they're often considered what is called a knowledge-based game. You're improving and achieving victory by actually getting better at the game, rather than simply outstatting your opponents. You could do that if you want, and it plays some role, but it's really that feeling of achieving a new level of skill of the game itself that is so rewarding. One of my favorite parts of From Software games, and something they absolutely excel at, is showing upcoming locations in the distance from other levels. Something I just talked about in my Shadow of the Erdtree video, where it is done brilliantly. This plays a huge role in building a cohesive world, and in this scenario, we can see past the beautiful moonlit lake, forsaken Cainhurst Castle in the distance, which we will travel to later via Hemwick Charnel Lane. Upon reaching the end of the level and figuring out the Mad One wasn't my main foe, in returning I found a much different type of boss. Funny enough, the Mad Ones don't spawn at all if you have zero insight. I assume you have to die and come back with no insight for this to work, as you gain insight when entering the arena, but don't hold me to that. Once I gained my bearings, the only real danger was being snared up in a magic witch trap and being deleted while helpless by the Mad Ones. While it's not the most exhilarating contest, I always appreciate a game trying something a little different, and I truly think that scattering throughout the game contrasting bosses like this against more action combat-oriented ones is important for the pacing of the game. Witch of Hemwick isn't admittedly my favorite boss, and I realize these puzzle bosses that are a guns-blazing fight don't always land, but I appreciate developers trying something different. Bosses like this are so much more memorable than a foe that has sweet combat, but is basically just a reskin with a slightly different moveset as countless other foes. Forbidden Woods and Shadow of Yharnam. After defeating the Witch of Hemwick, we make our way back through the Cathedral ward to deliver the password discovered from defeating Vicar Amelia to enter the long and tangled Forbidden Woods. The Rune Workshop tool dropped by the Witch of Hemwick allows us to equip Carol runes, which essentially act in part as rings from Demon Souls and Dark Souls. The main difference is that these must be equipped via the workstation in the Hunter's Dream. This isn't a topic that comes up in PvE so much as PvP, but the idea of ring swapping while running around in combat has always been immersion breaking, if not a bit silly to me. Granted, I do this myself while PvPing, as in many scenarios, you're handicapping yourself against good players by not doing it. As well, being entirely made-up worlds filled with fantasy where you're somehow invincible to damage while rolling at the right time, it's hard to complain too much about this topic. It's not something I'll lose sleep over, but there's something to be said about having to think about your loadout before entering a level, rather than being able to switch in a menu on the fly. But on the flip side, there's something to be said about having the ability to think and be adaptive during combat and traversal, so I suppose it's a 6 of one, half dozen of another situation. The Forbidden Woods were literally an absolute nightmare on my first run, as it's a pretty large departure from the level design up to this point. Prior to reaching this twisted, tangled, disorienting zone, most of Yharnam had been, while difficult, fairly linear and straightforward, with narrow corridors and a low likelihood of getting lost. On your first trek, and even now, so much of the Forbidden Woods, especially the latter half, looks exactly the same, causing enormous confusion as to where you've been and where you're going. I'm assuming this was exactly the intention, however, to discombobulate you in the eerie, spooky, confusing woods. This is also likely the first point in the game where you'll see another direction of the story open up as we come across a grouping of small celestial emissaries. Having no prior knowledge of the stories of H.P. Lovecraft, this was a massive curveball for me. Why the heck are aliens in this game? What does this have to do with anything else I've seen so far? It almost seems like they were dropped into the wrong game. It's one of those simple things that make you think, okay, well, definitely have to keep playing to see what this is all about. And it's in further exploration of the Forbidden Woods that we come across one of the most seemingly implausible connections in the entire game, that being two spectacularly tall ladders that connect from a location seemingly miles away from where we began to a rear entrance of Yosefka's clinic. It's here that we can find imposter Yosefka, as well likely regular Yosefka, now a celestial being who drops one of her vials, as well as an invitation to Forsaken Castle Cainhurst can be found. Back to the Forbidden Woods, in addition to these otherworldly beings, we are greeted by an enemy that personally sends shivers up my spine in the form of the vermin host, this Medusa-looking figure spawning serpents from his head. While a new unique enemy that adds plenty to the atmosphere, killing countless snakes that are slowly crawling along the ground doesn't make for the most enthralling combat. As well, while they're horrifying at first sight, once you get behind the larger variety, they go down pretty easily as well. I once thought the Shadow of Yharnam to be near impossible and was the original breaking point for me in Bloodborne. How on earth is one man supposed to defeat 3 enemies? My distinct lack in the skill of spacing out 3 opponents made this boss seem beyond my reach and caused me to take a 4 to 5 month break from the game, upon which point I likely googled how and where to summon NPCs and 3v3'd them with old Hunter Enrique and the younger Medeiros twin. Another excuse I have on offer is the Shadow of Yharnam has one of the worst runbacks in the series, especially for a first-time player unfamiliar with the complicated weavings and indistinguishable scenery, or lack thereof, in the Forbidden Woods. This is a problem that I believe From Software realized and rectified in later games, as the runbacks have become greatly reduced and designed out almost altogether with each successive entry. Whereas in Demon's Souls, the runback is usually the entire level, most Sculptor's idols are in close proximity to the boss, and in Elden Ring, the Site of Grace or Stake of Marika is equally as close. That being said, I find these guys to be one of the most underrated bosses in Bloodborne and represent yet a new and unique type of boss in the game. As well, once I came to grips with fighting multiple opponents at once, something not generally advisable in the game, which is why this fight is so difficult at first, it's no longer the stumbling block it once was for me. The fight really teaches you how to space out a trio of enemies, when to jump into action, and when to be patient, as well as how to kite off enemies using obstacles. As well, how cool is the idea of Shadow Samurai with fire that gate off Byrgenwerth? Of course, in the grand finale, we get the massive Medeiros whistle-like snake attack that will look familiar to anyone that has recently fought Mesmer in Shadow of the Erdtree. Upon victory, we are granted access to the famous and long-awaited College of Byrgenwerth. Byrgenwerth and Rom the Vacuous Spider. While on one hand, it's initially surprising to find that Byrgenwerth consists of this modest one-building campus, as the college is no longer a thriving learning center, yet a long-abandoned facility. It's also possible other buildings existed at one point, but have been destroyed or lost to time and decay, perhaps elsewhere in the Forbidden Woods. You do get the feeling Byrgenwerth was supposed to be an elite learning center for a small number of people anyhow, so the small size makes sense on that front as well. For all the complaining about reused assets and monotonous enemies in games today, almost every area in Bloodborne has at least a couple of new enemy types, even small areas such as Byrgenwerth in the form of the Garden of Eyes fly enemies and the Celestial Centipede, while combat really isn't the point of Byrgenwerth, as it's more of a lore dump and way to transition the player to Ghul, Unseen Village, and progress the story. I take more interest in the lore than I might make it seem sometimes, and one of my favorite theories is that the trap hatch door on the floor in Byrgenwerth leads down to the Chalice dungeons. When doing a quick search for writing this section, I saw someone said it's hiding Master Willem's manga and anime collection, which I got a good laugh out of. Props to you, XX Capri XX, whoever you are. Anyways, once dealing with the hostile choir hunter, the real boss of Byrgenwerth, given her devastating usage of A Call Beyond and retrieving the key, we finally meet the husk of Master Willem. Again, maybe it's due to the break I took on the Shadow of Yharnam or not trying hard enough to retain information, but I think it's pretty likely by the time I got here, I completely forgot this was the same guy I saw in the cutscene post-Vicar Amelia. Anyhow, we meet the decrepit figure I assume now is such due to consuming too much insight beyond human limits and losing his humanity in the process of trying to ascend. As for Rom herself, you can fight her one of two ways. Number one, painstakingly eliminate every minion spider one by one, essentially ridding Rom of her shield, as beyond them she has limited defense. Or bypassing them entirely, quickly getting in and out, usually aided by a high DPS setup. The heavy lore implications, alluring arena, and aesthetic design of Rom are what carries this encounter, as the combat can lead towards feeling more like a chore. Rom signals a turning point in the game, bringing about the Blood Moon, which alters the composition of Hypogean jail into Ghul, as well as ends or changes a number of NPC quest lines. To be honest, while I appreciate the implications of her acting as a veil to the Mensis ritual, I can't say I love the fight from a combat perspective, as I find constantly looking up into the sky for her arcane attacks while avoiding minion spiders a bit monotonous. Ghul, Unseen Village, Hypogean Jail, Darkbeast Paarl, and the One Reborn. Upon defeating Rom, we're transported to the now open gates of the village of Ghul, Unseen Village, which of course will look familiar if we were previously kidnapped by a snatcher lurking in the shadows of Cathedral Ward and taken to Hypogean Jail, one of the most intimidating and haunting moments in Bloodborne. As if I wasn't already jumpy enough, being captured and taken to a new location certainly didn't ease those fears. And that's before the spine-tingling chanting kicks in, which, someone can correct me if I'm wrong, but is the chanting of the Mensis ritual. While our journey or kidnapping is short-lived on this occasion, we can fight Darkbeast Paarl at this time, who is another one of the more underrated bosses in Bloodborne. Maybe it's just the exciting electric look to him, as I realize the staggering of his limbs can be easily abused if you time your attacks just right. As well, he can be a little janky and tough to chase down if you aren't patient, which, admittedly, I'm not the greatest at avoiding his front-facing swipes. Probably why I enjoy the more difficult Chalice Dungeon version better, where he's much more difficult to simply outstat and more skill is required on my end. As I mentioned previously, Darkbeast Paarl guards the backdoor entrance to Old Yharnam, in which you can befriend Jura, which is a nice touch. The game world feels much more fluid and alive when your actions change the behavior of the NPCs. The blood-red moon and eerie purple sky of course contribute to the horrifying atmosphere, along with the disgusting undead boar-like enemies as skeleton werewolves with legs coming out of their assholes. Add in the now visible Amygdala draped all over the buildings of this nightmare and Bell Maiden's respawning enemies. Oh, and the Amygdala shoot lasers at you, so good luck with that. This may be unpopular, but I quite enjoy the Ghul gang squad, as they provide a nice little skill checkpoint fairly close to a lamp, so you don't have to backtrack too far should you perish in combat. As well, there are ways to lure them out one at a time and play games with their AI if you really want to. As I haven't fitted in yet, and this is a lengthy area where you'll likely need some blood vials, especially on a first run, this is as good a spot as any to discuss the healing system. An obvious differentiation point from other From Software entries is the usage of found and farmed blood vials capped at 20, barring rune enhancements, as opposed to a refillable flask or gourd. A single blood vial refills 40% of the player's health regardless of stat enhancement unless you have the Radiance rune equipped, which increases HP recovery. However, this rune isn't found until the back half of the game. Does anyone actively enjoy farming in video games? Unlikely if you're a first-timer in Bloodborne just trying to make your way through the game once, and it takes all of your fortitude to continue around every corner. It's highly unlikely you'll want to farm common mobs for blood vials, something you're almost assured to do as a new player. There's no fun or added fulfillment from having to continuously kill werewolves and the large trolls for blood vials. I don't know why From Software switched to a system where heals were a dropped or picked up item, but being that they haven't implemented this since, I think they learned from this mistake. It's by no means game-breaking or an egregious design choice, but it's not the best version of a healing system. There's a reason From Software has since adopted the Estus refill system full-time, as in Dark Souls 3, the Gourd in Sekiro, and the Flask of Crimson Tears in Elden Ring, as it is superior. One could argue the limited supply of blood vials teaches the player to be more careful in combat, or that needing to go farm improves their skill and that they have to practice fighting similar enemies repeatedly, but the annoyance of having to do this far outweighs these two factors. If you're trying to make your way to an end of a video game, having to go back to the Great Bridge, for example, and farm werewolves and brick trolls is just frustrating and kills your momentum. Granted, you can buy vials in the Hunter's Dream, but I think we'd all like to level up our character, not buy blood vials. Whereas Demon Souls had a one-time consumable-based healing system, Dark Souls improved drastically on this by devising the Estus Flask refill system. Dark Souls 2 basically combines Demon Souls and Dark Souls by having one-time consumables on top of the Estus Flask, providing basically unlimited healing. Barring a couple of limited quantity special items, Bloodborne leaves the player with simply blood vials that may be found as picked up items or farmed from enemies. As well, I mentioned you can buy them from the messengers. In returning to Ghul specifically and closing in on the boss of one of the most eerie, disorienting, and I'd say difficult levels given how many nooks, crannies, branching paths, and sheer amount of total enemies there are, we come as close as we have to the Blood Moon and possibly the most disturbing cutscene in the game. As I've mentioned a number of times on my channel, I once thought the one Reborn was literally the boss of the game due to the aforementioned incredibly tough run-up through a long, arduous level and gruesome yet awe-inspiring cutscene. As well, being my first From Software game and not a naturally skilled player, I was probably sitting at around 40 to 50 hours of playtime already at this point. Of course, our nightmarish friend became much less difficult once finding the staircase to kill the Chime Maidens. Mind you, I hadn't played Demon Souls and fought the similarly structured Tower Knight at this point. He can still be tricky given his thrashing, dropping of skeletons, and poison piss puddle, but given his staggering, you can put the poor guy out of his misery by DPSing him to death. Upper Cathedral Ward, Celestial Emissary, and Ebrietas. We now cross into a handful of optional endgame areas in Upper Cathedral Ward, Forsaken Castle Cainhurst, and the Nightmare Frontier, but we'll start with Upper Cathedral Ward, given you could locate the key to its entrance in the previous area of Ghul. I know I use the word eerie a lot when talking about Bloodborne, but it is pretty apt, and Upper Cathedral Ward suits this adjective, and it hides away one of the most important bosses in the story of Bloodborne in the Celestial Emissary. These little guys just pull the whole thing together. Now, obviously I'm talking about Ebrietas, but I do find the Celestial Emissary to be kind of hilarious and a fun little boss. While the atmosphere is delightfully haunting far above the city street of Yharnam, I expect being home of the choir, the most elite branch of the healing church, there would have been some more important NPCs up here, either to fight or gain dialogue from. As well, while I suppose it's an extension of Yharnam below, this is one of the few areas that really doesn't introduce any new enemy types, although in fairness, it is pretty far into the game and optional. And while I realize I'm being nitpicky here, it feels like the large main room with the chandelier and werewolves could have been arranged in a way that didn't lead to the good old door cheese. I realize this is on me and I could just not do that, but given being mauled by werewolves is the other option, if things go south, I usually take this path. Those complaints aside, it's a brilliant idea for a level location high above the city and what almost feels like Bloodborne's attempt at a stealth level. Everything about the layout and enemy placement urges the player to approach in that manner, which maybe I just need to up my Bloodborne stealthing abilities instead of complaining about door cheese. This is further evidenced by the Cosmic Eye Watcher badge found in the area that unlocks blue elixir for purchase via the Insight Bath. As I realize I mention this routinely, but difficulty in games should generally trend up, but with peaks and valleys, ebbs and flows. It shouldn't be a diagonal line from bottom left to top right. This is why the Celestial Emissary is a perfect choice to slide in just before Ebrietas. They had something unique and a layer of silliness, but with legitimate lore implications right before the main event. I originally felt a nice little reprieve with them acting as a small confidence booster. From Software is generally good about this, as in also placing the Living Failures before Lady Maria and Ancient Wyvern before Nameless King in Dark Souls 3. But that first time just stumbling into a room and seeing these goofy alien creatures start to scurry out, followed by a boss health bar popping up, was a pretty funny sight. The tiny Tonitrus, if running an arcane build, obliterates a path of these guys, which is quite entertaining. Once taking out their Gigantor Overlord, we make our way down to Ebrietas, taking the drastic switch from fighting one of the easiest bosses in the game to one of the most difficult. Although Bloodborne is the From Software game I've been playing the longest, it's the one I struggle with the most on higher new game cycles, especially against monstrosities. I find many boss attacks much tougher to position against and avoid when coming from the large body of a beast rather than the swift sword of a human. For example, no matter how many YouTube videos I watch and how many times I practice, 9 out of 10 times I'm getting smoked by Ebrietas' charge attack. Locked on, locked off, near, far. It's just an attack I've never been able to successfully deal with on a consistent basis. An attack that basically just one-shots you on any New Game Plus cycle. The way the animation is telegraphed processes in my brain as if I had the reaction time of an 85-year-old man. Defeat of Ebrietas is simplified these days, recognizing how to dodge in and out to take advantage of tagging your large head for the stagger. While with most monstrosities, I'm apt to adopt the ancient art of smack dab booty, this technique works slightly less against Ebrietas unless you manage to get stuck between her tail fin and have good RNG. I also find her to be aesthetically one of the most majestic, immaculate creatures in Bloodborne, which she should be as arguably the most important great one in which it's implied Willem may have had some sort of commune with, as well as Laurence likely encountered her either direct or indirectly. Again, I don't claim to be a lore buff, but this is what I understand. I believe at the very least she was discovered by the Healing Church, which founded the choir to protect and study her, although possibly out of search for power rather than benevolence. And what I do appreciate about the lore of From Software games is much of the story is up to the player's interpretation of events rather than the heavy-handed lecturing we get in medi-modern Western games. Personal diatribe aside, the purple tinge of the arena splashes beautifully behind Ebrietas' pale blue figure, especially once she begins tapping into her version of A Call Beyond, and once the OST kicks in just right, we have an absolutely immaculately celestial scene. This boss is just a work of art. Forsaken Castle Cainhurst and Martyr Logarius. Arguably the best introduction to any level in the game as we enter on our grand but undead carriage by way of Hemwick Charnel Lane. The imagination involved in this traversal is a fantastic solution to a level separate from the mainland. Although when first arriving you think, wow, this is pretty sparse, where is everyone? Why is it so quiet? What an empty area. But you learn of the battle that took place between the Vilebloods and the Executioners at some point in the past, which accounts for the ghostly figures strewn throughout the castle and the sparse nature of enemies. Although it makes a ton of sense lore-wise, I can't say fighting half-invisible, ethereal ghost women known as Silver Ladies is the world's most exciting combat, but we do have the ever-creepy Bloodlickers, lancing rapier users, these gargoyles, apparently called Lost Children of Antiquity, and some parasite larvae, funnily called hateful maggots, which seem appropriate for how irritating they are. While the enemies aren't perhaps the most exciting, and maybe I'm just a sucker for a snow-covered castle illuminated by a beautiful moon on the lake, but this is arguably the most picturesque level in the game. Bloodborne has a distinctive art style. Its graphical quality and fidelity to reality could be criticized, but it would never be confused with another game. You wouldn't look at Bloodborne and mistake it for anything else, especially from an environmental standpoint where so many games now, especially made in popular, powerful engines like Unreal Engine 5, are starting to feature extremely similar looking cityscapes or forests. How many games have you played recently where a city or forest could be plopped into a number of other given games and not look out of place? Speaking of out of place, I wanted to make this random combat note in regards to backstabs. While the implementation of the charged R2 to trigger a backstab possibility was a welcome solution to the brain-dead enemies and spacing problems in Dark Souls, From Software dropped this idea in follow-up games, although enemies in Dark Souls 3 and Elden Ring have much better tracking and are more difficult to chain backstab to death than in previous titles, so perhaps the developers felt this tinkering made the charged R2 unnecessary. Anyways, didn't know where to put that, but despite the perhaps lackluster combat of the common mobs at Forsaken Cainhurst Castle, the boss of the area and Grandpa Santa himself, Martyr Logarius, more than makes up for it in the form of one of the best bosses in the base game. Who doesn't love a fight on the highest roof of a grand castle covered in snow with a warlike anthem booming in the background? Just the perfect setting for a boss fight, and one against a tricky but fun opponent at that. Logarius obviously presents massive parry windows with his large frame, but can still be difficult to land past his casting of arcane spells, with one of the most satisfying parries being on the attack where he flies high into the air and quickly swoops down from above. Phase 2 provides quite a tough mix, as you must quickly shoot or attack his stake in the ground, or be irritatingly pelted by whatever these flying arcane knives are. Finally defeating our gargantuan foe and placing the crown of illusions upon our head reveals the immortal Queen Annalise and her tainted blood, as Alfred would say. Giving him the Cainhurst summons leads him to temporarily killing Queen Annalise, who can be revived via the Altar of Despair in the Ebrietas boss room, which reverses the flow of time, and further brings into question the exact time and place in which the mythical castle actually exists. Nightmare Frontier and Amygdala. In swapping over to the Nightmare Frontier, and I do realize I sort of glossed over the lecture hall, I just don't have anything of great note to say about it, as lore buffs I'm sure can go deep, as for world design, it essentially just exists to connect us to the Nightmare Frontier, as well as the Nightmare of Mensis, depending on which floor you're on. In this case, we're entering the classic poisonous swamp level of another From Software game, one that I ranked dead last in my area rankings video, which I doubt I'll get much argument about. It's not terrible on a technical level, and many of you probably enjoy it to some extent as a PvP hotspot, but it's not the most delightful level to play through, and maybe it shouldn't be, as it isn't the Sweet Dreams Frontier, it is the Nightmare Frontier after all. On top of poisonous swamps, have fun with the boulder-chucking abominable snowmen, winter lanterns, and sludge-spewing squids. Never mind this cave, possibly the most cancerous area in all of From Software, which I only went in for the sake of this footage. I will never again journey into this cave. These caves have a combination of standard poison, rapid poison, and frenzy status effects, all while restricting player movement. Successfully navigating this sort of difficulty feels less rewarding and more relieving that the section is finally over. We do have a couple of run-of-the-mill NPCs known as Hunters of Despair, likely from Yharnam and perhaps lured by patches or at least against their wills in some form. While the Nightmare Frontier isn't my favorite area, I would like to touch on the weapons of Bloodborne, which takes the quality over quantity approach, granting the player 26 main hand melee options. My personal favorites being the Chikage, which actually makes it disappointing for me how broken Rivers of Blood is in Elden Ring, but that's a story for another day, as well as the Whirligig Saw, Logarius' Wheel, the Bloodletter, and the trusty Hunter's Axe. As far as weapon total, for comparison, Dark Souls 3 has over 10 categories of melee weapons, including 17 versions of the straight sword alone. Dark Souls 3 has some incredibly fun weapons in its own right, so quality and quantity aren't necessarily mutually exclusive. Not to mention the Saw Cleaver, Saw Spear, and Beast Hunter Scythe have differing movesets, but aren't tremendously different in concept, so Bloodborne does have some level of replication as well. There's some unique builds you could come up with, but combat generally consists of one of 26 transformable melee weapons in your right hand and one of 16 artillery assisting options in your left, albeit 2 of these are torches, and is anyone really using the Fist of Gratia, the Lock Shield, or the Wooden Shield outside of meme-related purposes? Probably not. I would be remiss if not to mention the 12 or so arcane spells that exist, which essentially account for Bloodborne's limited magic system, with the Medeiros Whistle actually scaling on Blood Tinge. Whereas magic can generally be quite user-friendly in Demon Souls, the Dark Souls trilogy, and Elden Ring, it's anything but in Bloodborne, with an arcane-only build being a near impossibility on your first run. The main reason for this is the limitation and required management of consumable Quicksilver bullets, which arcane spells function on. While you can continuously sacrifice 30% of your health in exchange for blood bullets, this is a balance most likely above a first-time player's skill level, made more difficult by not yet having knowledge of level layouts and tough enemy placement. Now, you can always mix and match arcane spells with a melee build, but this requires proper stat balance, something not so easy to always judge right away. The Flame Sprayer, which has arcane scaling, is actually quite OP and fun to use in early game, as many enemies, mainly beast types, including almost all of Old Yharnam, which makes sense lore-wise, are weak to it. First-time runs seem to consist of a narrow spread, as from observation, players end up taking the Hunter's Axe to completion, likely due to its beginner-friendly range via the two-handed setup. The Saw Cleaver offers higher levels of damage against large beast enemies common throughout the game, assisted by the serrated effect. Many as well opt for the sheer power of Ludwig's Holy Blade due to its high damage output, perhaps also the familiarity and comfort in using a sword-type weapon as in Dark Souls. In getting back to the level itself, we conclude of course with Amygdala, who functions in an opposite manner to Darkbeast Paarl in that her legs and tail take virtually no damage, forcing the player to maintain a front-facing approach, dodging in and out, taking advantage of her head and arms as weak points. While the head with proper aggression gives plenty of opportunity for attack, I'm not as big of a fan of her arms being weak points, as they can be quite difficult to hit with short-ranged weapons, especially those lacking a vertical attack. Not that every boss has to be exactly vulnerable to every weapon layout. One of her largest weaknesses is actually to arcane, as you could spam her to death with executioner's gloves in like 10 seconds. On a melee run though, the fun part is avoiding her sweet laser attack, as she also launches high in the air to slam down on you. Her aesthetic fits perfectly with the dreary, drab, desert-like landscape, something Bloodborne excels at, by the way, in creating bosses that look like they might actually inhabit where you find them. Nightmare of Mensis, Micolash, Host of the Nightmare, and Mergo's Wet Nurse. The first part of the home stretch of the game is one of the most difficult and discombobulating, mainly due to the constant infliction of the Frenzy status effect, which we later find is inflicted by the Mother Brain. Dealing with this on your first run, especially as an inexperienced Soulsborne player, is a literal nightmare, as the balance of dealing with hiding and dodging upon rocks, possibly making use of blue elixir and sedatives while contending with the maggot-infested Laurence beasts as the boulder-throwing abominable snowmen return, is an extraordinarily difficult task. Not to mention, a sinister bell-ringing maiden summons invaders if you're playing online. Eventually, you'll run into a member of the choir, Edgar, who acts as a nice little mini NPC boss just before the first Mensis shortcut. Speaking of, the elevator system of Mensis is superb, as the suspense builds as you take elevators and shortcuts higher and higher up the haunted castle. We do have these silver enemies, apparently known as Mergo's attendants, but while most of Bloodborne is particularly strong about having a large variety in enemy type, the Nightmare of Mensis is pretty light on new foes. However, in line with final level difficulty, the stretch of winter lanterns through this corridor of rock formations is extremely tough to manage if you're trying to kill each of them, less so if you just want to sprint through. One thing I surprisingly haven't noted so far is the rally mechanic, which is one of my favorites in any game I've played. It's such an elegant way to get players to play more aggressively and always feels rewarding, especially when recovering full vitality from riposting off a partial parry. Nor have I directly made great mention of the fun combinations created by hitting L1 to dynamically attack opponents. This always feels so satisfying and rewarding, no matter how many times I do it. The brilliance of Bloodborne's combat lies in how simple it is, with two seemingly minor mechanics helping to create such a fun system. How many games have you played that have endless button combinations, maneuvers, and mechanics, and the combat is boring after an hour? It really shows the genius a simple system can have. While I finish licking Bloodborne's ballsack, I regrettably come to Micolash, who permanently resides on the Mount Rushmore of irritating Soulsborne bosses, comfortably next to the bed of bullshit, chaos. Micolash, Host of the Nightmare, greatly strains my argument in favor of including unique and different boss types to the fullest extent. As well, being one of the most memorable bosses in the series, the actual gameplay is completely infuriating. At the very least, he does have deep lore implications, as he seems to be stuck maniacally in some sort of eternal torment, as his quest for ascension went catastrophically wrong, where his body lies dead in the waking world, just after the one reborn, but alive in the nightmare. Lore aside, do I enjoy chasing around a grown man with a cage on his head who sounds one step removed from Herbert the Pervert from Family Guy, who also tries to one-shot me with the Call Beyond? No, not really. Moving past Micolash, we run into a number of Shadow of Yharnam enemies on the home stretch, and I know a lot of games do this and it's just a personal preference, but I've never been the biggest fan of seeing previous bosses wandering around as common mobs later in the same game. I guess it's just a pet peeve of mine, but it sort of makes their main boss experience feel less special and unique. To me, bosses should be special encounters and not have weakened clones of themselves roaming around. Not a deal breaker, but just a little something that ever so slightly irks me. But on a positive note, I do enjoy the entertainment in getting enemies to fight each other with the boars and shadows on this final stretch. This helps build immersion and makes it feel less like the player exists in sole opposition to the entire game. We eventually come across Yharnam, Temerian Queen, after previously having made an appearance at the Moonside Lake. Which reminds me, I remember once reading Miyazaki was working on this game while his wife was pregnant, which, I'm not gonna lie, is kinda disturbing. Hey, maybe the man just has a fantastic work-life balance. As well, a lot of geniuses are a little off, so who can blame the guy? Anyways, before anyone takes any of that to heart, I'm obviously joking around. Yharnam sort of acts as a link between the ancient subterranean Temerians and the Great Ones, as well is assumed to be the mother of Mergo. Once again, I'm no lore expert, but from my minimal understanding, Yharnam became pregnant by the Great One Odin, which gained her some sort of status elevation, but in the process lost the child Mergo, as partially evidenced by the Yharnam stone she drops upon defeat in the Chalice dungeons. So, not a very uplifting story. Great boss fight, though. But in all seriousness, it represents the continuing theme in Bloodborne of chasing forbidden knowledge too great for humans to harness. Without going into a long aside, a couple of real-life examples that would make sense to me would be nuclear power, which can provide tremendous amounts of energy for humanity, but have also caused events like the Chernobyl disaster. Another might be genetic engineering, which could possibly cure disease, but obviously would open a huge Pandora's box. I'm not saying what's right or wrong, just what I gather with my limited understanding of Bloodborne and Lovecraftian lore. Turning to Mergo's wet nurse, just up ahead, whose contrast of purple and black on the Raven-themed attire create an aesthetically beautiful end to the Nightmare of Mensis. You'd expect maybe a tougher boss at this point, but perhaps this entity is just a warm-up for what's ahead in the finale double fight of the base game. As I've referenced in the past, my first playthrough of Bloodborne took 108 hours, albeit including the DLC, so at this stage, a relative easy boss was more than welcome. While Mergo has a relatively small moveset of swiping blades, the cloning phase can be pretty disorienting and is one where I generally just run in circles until it ends, although it does look pretty cool. Musically, we have a departure from the grand orchestral arrangements of other boss tracks, the hauntingly beautiful lullaby that you can previously have heard at other points of the game, namely Central Yharnam, plays as the backdrop in this decrepit arena and fits in just right. The Hunter's Nightmare, Ludwig, and Laurence. While we can now technically just end the game by heading to Gehrman, we'll detour into arguably the best part of Bloodborne in the DLC and the Hunter's Nightmare, where we duel the badass blood-drunk NPC hunters. The visual of this convoluted version of Yharnam and approaching the first old hunters and realizing they're quite literally hunting the beasts is one of the biggest holy crap moments in the game. Similar to the ending stretch of Nightmare of Mensis, enemies in combat against one another always helps the world feel alive, like they were actually doing something other than simply just waiting for you to show up. Other than the NPC hunter duels, this area is action-packed and filled with content, also containing a random blood-starved beast, whose placement does make sense given the cave he resides in caps off the end of the Blood River running through the area, this guy with a Gatling gun, this half-beast, half-human NPC, giant church dudes, especially the cannon-wielding variety, you meet Simon, and oh, not to mention, you eventually loop back to Laurence as well. Combat-wise, the Hunter's Nightmare is about as good as it gets due to the sheer variety in enemy type as well as their placements. Granted, there is a high volume of enemies, but being endgame DLC, the area is supposed to have a high level of difficulty. As commonplace, there is a nicely placed shortcut that loops back around to the starting lamp, generously close to the Blood River cave that can be quite tricky. As is pretty typical with From Software DLCs, we gain access to some of the coolest weapons in the game, including the Whirligig Saw and the unique Amygdala arm. As we make our way down the Blood River and collect the 5 free blood vials that are nicely left for us, we encounter Ludwig, who is undoubtedly From Software at their very best. From the mid-fight cutscene introducing the Holy Moonlight Sword, to the crisp dodges and timing involved, to the stunning soundtrack, this fight is boss perfection. The difficulty is quite high, but not insurmountable once you learn his patterns. Part 1 of this fight is quite rambunctious as Ludwig thrashes about on all 4 limbs, but as long as you steer clear of his charge attack and don't get too greedy, you can chip away at him. Part 2 evolves into a beautiful symphony as Ludwig's attacks almost coincide with the soundtrack itself as you dodge the attacks of the Holy Moonlight Sword, which looks absolutely stunning in Bloodborne. This all culminates in a riposte for the win and a small conversation with Ludwig. In the next small area, we can retrieve Laurence's skull from the altar and return to his resting body to fight the Cleric beast, except on fire, with a wider moveset, a starkly different final phase, and oh yeah, he hits like a Mack truck. Certainly one of the most difficult bosses in the game due to the sheer damage he can output, with his 3-swipe attack likely to send you back to the lamp. Laurence presents more than a formidable way to close out one of the best DLCs in gaming if you left him for after Orphan a Cause. He fights you amidst a beautifully memorable soundtrack which perfectly captures a grand church choir which suits Laurence's founding and downfall of the Healing Church. Having betrayed Master Willem at Byrgenwerth, Laurence succumbed to the ministration of blood, causing his downfall and transformation. While maybe not the most unique beast, having faced a version once already, the grand scale of him in the Cathedral, along with the feeling of accomplishment when conquering him, surely puts him amongst the best creations in the game. Research Hall, Living Failures, and Lady Maria of the Astral Clock Tower. And returning back through Ludwig's boss arena and a narrow corridor and chapel area with a couple of fun NPCs to fight, we begin climbing the haunting tower of horrifying experimentation and torture known as the Research Hall. This can be quite bone-chilling on initial runs as you wonder what the hell took place in this building. Quite the departure from the rest of Bloodborne, it is the only area in the game purely built vertically. Most amazing about the layout of the Research Hall is that the whole building only has one lamp, accomplished through the inclusion of the massive rotating stairs in the center of the building, as well as a few classic elevator shortcuts. This is obviously played upon in a similar manner in Shadow of the Erdtree with Shadowkeep. I absolutely love areas like this where you can activate a lever or mechanism that makes previously unreachable parts of the level accessible. I find this to be such clever level design and satisfying once you can reach those spots you previously kept seeing and thought, I wonder how you get over there. As well, it allows for quite an expansive amount of exploring in a seemingly limited structure. Of course, there are areas that could be better and exceptions, but on a broad note, From Software has mastered jam-packing phenomenal content within relatively small areas to prevent the player feeling as though they are running from place A to B just for the sake of progressing. The enemy design makes sense for the building as well, as the Clock Tower patients, who were the original experiments of the Healing Church, aimlessly patrol the area. They are unique lore-wise, but they have a limited moveset, and the sheer amount of them can become monotonous. Good luck finding your echoes should you lose them in this place. As well, by this late stage of the game, I would have liked the NPC hunter to be a more challenging encounter, or at least be differentiated in some way. Those are small bones to pick though, as the end of the level culminates in a nice double boss fight. First, an encounter with the Living Failures, who present a Cosmos-like garden arena and an underrated cinematic soundtrack, followed by a fan-favorite boss and objectively one of the best From Software has ever produced in Lady Maria. A small aside that I liked, the brain fluid dropped by St. Adeline has a line that reads, "We fail to recognize our own latent potential until the moment it is lost and we sense its absence." I'm pretty sure Miyazaki just said, get off your ass and start working on your goals right now. The best thing about the Living Failures is that they're the only thing standing between you and one of the most beloved bosses in the entire Soulsborne series. But this boss rests on the other end of that dichotomy. Not particularly a gank boss, as they trudge so slowly it doesn't matter that they outnumber you 4-1. Parries and backstabs are the keys to this one, as you again basically run in circles to isolate one unless you possess the skill to fight multiple at once. They do sport what is one of my favorite arenas, as this rooftop garden beneath the Astral Clock Tower is quite stunning, as well as the spectacular soundtrack that's probably slept on due to how lackluster the combat is. They also hold some decent lore, as perhaps the Living Failures were early attempts of the Healing Church trying to create the Celestial Emissary. Either way, these Living Failures are aptly named, as they can easily be chipped away at until victory. Not a boss for the history books. On the other hand, as I know I mention constantly, I very much like warm-up bosses that add a layer of lore before the grand finale, in this case Lady Maria of the Astral Clock Tower. Lady Maria, a fan favorite for sure. One of the most popular bosses in the entire series, and for good reason. Lady Maria is a prime example of From Software's exemplary storytelling without saying a word as she transitions through 3 distinct phases. She tries to take you out straight up, can't get you, succumbs to the power of the blood as her Rakuyo itself reads, she frowned upon Bloodblades despite being a distant relative of the Queen, and in a last gasp attempt to ward off the player from discovering the fishing hamlet, she imbues the blades with the power of fire, demonstrating she'll go to any length to stop you. A violent yet beautiful dance in terms of gameplay mechanics. A 3-part show of dancing, blood, and fire. Part 1 can somewhat be simplified by dodging past Lady Maria and getting a few shots in or parrying and following up with a riposte. She turns more violent in Phase 2, resorting to her abandoned ways of the Vile Bloods in order to stop you, as well as adding in 2 special attacks. The climax is Lady Maria going full-out fire mode for a frantic yet beautiful finale. The feeling of a violent dance is always a delight to play. In terms of lore, Lady Maria is a distant relative to Queen Annalise and a citizen of Cainhurst. She originally studied under Gehrman, but turned sour on hunting at some point, mentioning a corpse should be left well alone, perhaps referring to Kos or herself. The doll strikes a similar resemblance to Lady Maria as well. All in all, this encounter sports a beautiful dojo-like arena with the sunlight trickling through, a stunning orchestral arrangement that is paced just right, one of the most memorable cutscenes in the series to open the fight, and the actual design of Lady Maria herself makes this one of the best boss fights From Software has ever produced. Fishing Hamlet and Orphan of Cause. The Fishing Hamlet is the culmination of the masterpiece that is the Old Hunters DLC. This quaint seaside fishing town offers a wonderful ecosystem of lovely flora and fauna. Seriously, you'll run into one of the most difficult non-boss encounters in the series. From Software did a tremendous job creating an environment with a unique color palette and textures that contrast nicely with the rest of Bloodborne, as the Fishing Hamlet is a hidden away seaside village town that was once serene and peaceful, but is now a death trap. Fishing Hamlet has excellent enemy design and placement, as you are first introduced to a waking fishman, giving the player a chance to identify the new enemy type, followed by a few more fishman mobs, even more fishmen, and a fishman mage. Add in this giant fishman, culminating in the Big Daddy, the vaunted double fishman boss, but not a boss. This intro area is designed perfectly. It gives the player a little bit of everything and scales properly as you proceed, ending in an extremely difficult but optional encounter, which yields the grand prize of Lady Maria's Rakuyo, as she had abandoned her beloved Rakuyo, casting it into a dark well when she could stomach it no longer. Even more impressive is the fact this all takes place in a relatively small and concise area. As we bridge into part 2 of the Fishing Hamlet, we'll face many similar enemies and familiar foes, but Braider is worth mentioning, as this ambiguous assassin shrouded in mystery is a prevalent figure and adds in some nice NPC action as each battle victory yields a piece of his attire. While the first area is where the level shines, the subsequent area has some nicely placed classic From Software door and elevator shortcuts, along with a generous run back to one of the most erratic, creepy, and challenging bosses in the Orphan of Cause. If you like fighting man-child infants wielding placenta as a weapon on an eerie beach backdrop, this is the boss for you. Likely the most difficult boss in the game for most players, Orphan of Cause's sporadic nature makes him a nightmare to deal with in Phase 2. With some patience, Phase 1 is actually more telegraphed than you'd think, but I doubt I thought this on my original playthrough. Orphan of Cause is quite the departure from most Bloodborne bosses. Highly erratic, kind of humanoid, but with a strange frenetic moveset, this is quite the unique challenge. As we hit Phase 2, he grows in size and, if possible, becomes even more erratic than Phase 1, even being able to summon lightning from the shoreline where the corpse of Cause lies. The arena itself is mostly just a flat beach and shore, but the setting and atmosphere work perfect for this chaotic finale to the DLC had you already taken on Laurence. One of 3 bosses who displays Nightmare Slain upon defeat, you'll certainly need to recover your breath upon besting the Orphan for the first time. The soundtrack isn't one of Bloodborne's more memorable, but its frenetic pacing, especially in Part 2, accompanies the fight well. It is posited that the spirit will linger with the corpse until the mother is slain, perhaps evidenced by the ending cutscene stating the child has returned to the ocean and killing it has freed it to traverse the cosmos. Hunter's Dream, Gehrman the First Hunter, and the Moon Presence. After completing the brilliant DLC, there's nothing left to do but consume 3 chords shall you want a double finale boss encounter and meet Gehrman under the large tree in the Hunter's Dream. Gehrman the First Hunter dramatically rises from his wheelchair upon refusal of your submission to deliver one of the best opening boss scenes in the game. One of the most hauntingly beautiful, serene arenas, dueling Gehrman on the wonderful rolling hill covered in delicate white flowers under the glowing full moon to create one of the best arenas in a glorious final battle. Gehrman presents many challenges that the game has prepared you for all along. Dodging, parrying, in and out timing, and stamina management are all necessary to beat the first hunter. A stunningly beautiful orchestral arrangement accompanies this duel as Gehrman wields his giant burial blade with great dexterity. As one of the main characters in the game, an entire video could be dedicated to the lore of Gehrman. It should be known that Gehrman is responsible story-wise for the lack of shield play in Bloodborne. He purposely lacks armor and wears common clothing to allow for quick fluid movement, which he displays throughout the contest. Also, his burial blade spawned the idea of trick weapons. All in all, Gehrman is a well-balanced boss who presents a challenge to first-time players, but is not insurmountable with a little practice. Moon Presence often feels more like a victory lap boss, which From Software does have a history of ending games on back-to-back bosses, and the hardest part will probably be your depleted resources from fighting Gehrman. If he takes you out, you will most likely smack him around once fully replenished. If you've made it this far, Moon Presence really doesn't present anything more difficult than you've faced so far. Perhaps there's a lore reason, but I always wonder why a boss would have an attack that always leaves you with 1 HP. Why wouldn't the attack just kill you if it leaves anyone with 1 HP? I'm not a big fan of completely unavoidable attacks, but will admit it is fun to see how much health you can rally back as Moon Presence takes quite a breather following this nuke of an attack. The soundtrack, while well produced like others in the game, isn't one you'll probably listen to time and again. Being a great one, the Moon Presence was originally summoned by Laurence, as referenced by a note in the second floor of the lecture building. As well referenced by a second floor lecture hall note, the Moon Presence may be trying to hunt great ones and uses the Hunter's Dream as a way to carry out his goals. In consuming 3 chords and rejecting the Moon Presence, we ourselves become a baby great one. Where do we go from here? Who knows, maybe turn into a super cool cosmic entity ourselves. Like I try to gently bring up from time to time, I find it fun in terms of a video game to follow the lore and try to understand what's happening, and it can definitely be interesting and fun to follow. Is it something that sticks with me and really affects my life or thinking in a meaningful way? Honestly, no, not really, but that doesn't mean I don't enjoy it from an entertainment perspective and appreciate those who obsessively dive into the background of these creative universes. A game I can still pick up and run through at least once or twice a year, and given that it was my introduction to From Software, still arguably my favorite in the series. Of course, depending on the day of the week you ask me, in which I could say almost any other game, except Dark Souls 2. Dark Souls 2 is never my favorite. Just kidding, I do like Dark Souls 2, it's just fun to rile up people that think everyone else hates Dark Souls 2. Okay, seriously, goodbye, have a great day everyone.